Hey, this is Christian Roldan.
And Jordan Morris from the Seattle Sounders Football Club.
And you're listening to
This is Nos Odietis.
This episode of Nos Odietis is sponsored by Full Pull Wines, a Seattle-based wine retailer and proud sponsor of Nos Odietis since 2011. Full Pull was founded in 2009, is based in Seattle, and is owned and operated by longtime Sounders supporters. They offer the best boutique wines of the world to members of their mailing list, with special focus on their home, the Pacific Northwest.
Here we go. Come on! Hey, O'Shan! Let's go!
A sideline fry! The Seattle Sounders have done it! MLS Cup winners!
Here comes Rangers through the middle to crown it for Seattle! And now they truly can start the celebrations. It's the Sounders MLS Cup.
Nicola Dero leaves absolutely no doubt! The Sounders rule the region!
Seattle Sounders is going good!
They've scored! They've scored! Finally!
This feels fucking awesome.
This is a tiny dog.
Is that what you young people call twerking?
And Porter says cheated!
We want to win. This is the Seattle Sounders, bro.
Welcome to another edition of Nos Odietis, sponsored by Full Pull Wines, Watson's Counter, and our subscribers. We're recording on Friday, December 8th, 2023. I am your host, Jeremiah Shan. Joining me today for our special end-of-season roundtable are my Sounder Art co-contributors, Mark Kastner, Tim Foss, and Susie Rantz. You may have noticed that I did not give an episode number today, and that's because we're finally moving away from that to limit confusion, as we're now putting a lot of episodes out that are both paid and unpaid, and it's not always clear which ones should be numbered. So all that said, please say hi, everyone.
Hey, how's it going?
Hello.
Hi, everyone.
So, I guess I should have told you guys to introduce yourselves too, but that first that went Tim, Mark, and Susie, but you know their voices by now. We probably don't need to introduce them. This is just a time to basically talk about the season, to get I guess this might be a new format for us. We haven't normally done this sort of like structured roundtable, but what I want to do is sort of open with a few different questions, or open with a question, and we'll go around and we'll just kind of discuss those and see how it goes. But let me start with a big one, and I'll ask you, Tim, to weigh in first. Did you feel like 2023 was a successful season for the Sounders?
It's a weird question because I think it's a reasonable question to ask. And I feel like in a more micro sense, looking at this season on its own, a season where you don't really make a run for any of the trophies on offer, kind of fell flat in Club World Cup, and went out in effectively the quarterfinals for MLS Cup. That's not a success by Seattle Sounders standards. I think if you look at it on a larger scale, the fact that they still played pretty well. They had a boring, frustrating stretch in the middle of the season, but even that, the bottom never fell out. They treaded water until they were able to turn things around towards the end of the season, and they did it while transitioning to a new system of play. They answered a lot of questions during the season that needed to be answered by the time they reached the off season. I think in those terms, it's a success. They set themselves up really well to move into 2024 and beyond. But looking at just this season, I think it's kind of hard to call it a true success.
So, Mark, I'll point out, kind of getting on the writing, that this was the first year since 2018 that the Sounders did not play in any finals. 2019, they obviously won MLS Cup. 2020, they played in MLS Cup. 2021, they played in a Leagues Cup final. 2022, they obviously won Champions League. So in that sense, not playing for a cup, and this is actually only the second time during the Brian Schmetzer era that they didn't play in a cup final. How much is that color your feeling on this season?
I guess the way that I think about this season is it was kind of a
kind of a resetting of standards, right? So I think pretty much we're all kind of comfortable with the assumption that winning CCL in May of 2022 was effectively the end of an era. That era kind of stretched out into the season with certain players and whatnot. But if we're gonna look backwards towards the Sounders in next year, several years, decades from now, and be like, this 2020 or this 2016 to 2022 ish team was an era, right?
Yeah.
And at the end of that era, they missed the playoffs for the very first time. And so this season was kind of all about like resetting the standards of the Sounders. And at, towards the end of last season, towards the end of the 2022 season, everybody in the organization said it was completely unacceptable to meet the playoffs or not make the playoffs. And so they reached their bare minimum of standard this season. Is that a success? No, it's not by their own standards. However, I think within the context of everything going on with this club and with this team, with this roster, with the upper management, it was a success to kind of like be able to say all of these external factors are happening right now, but we can still do this one thing. And so I guess to kind of like agree with Tim, it is a success, but not really. It won't be kind of going forward. And so, yeah, hopefully next year that's the 2024, the anniversary and everything, they start playing in finals again, and we can all just kind of be like, oh, that was weird. But a very clear like reset needed to happen with this team because Garth Lagerwey left, Nico Lodero's leaving, maybe Raul Ruidiaz is leaving, maybe some other kind of core pieces move on through one way or another. But what we know is like, the manager can figure it out because he did, like Tim mentioned it. They like completely changed during the season and it like worked. You have this like brand new facility you're moving into. You theoretically have like a new kind of cornerstone DP coming in. So yeah, I mean, they kind of reset everything. And now it's kind of like this season was either a success in 2 or 3 years once they built everything on it, or if everything they've done to kind of reset the standard fails, it could, So in the grand scheme of things, no, it's not a success. But it might very well turn out to be kind of this like cornerstone that the organization and us fans can kind of hold on to.
So yeah, this was actually an interesting conversational piece in the Discord today where we were talking a little bit about this season, and it kind of, I think I've thought about this before, but it did feel like 2023 on some level was always destined to sort of be a bridge to 2024, in that, like you said, there was a clear delineation between or that connected 2022 to 2016, and that they kind of had their crowning achievement of winning CCL. And in that sense, Susie, does it feel like this year we saw sufficient, and if you have a different take on whether or not this was a success, you're welcome to chime in, but to move it forward, does it feel like there was significant progress, or was there enough progress from your perspective in 2023?
I think it's hard to reflect like collectively because this season felt like so many different parts, like with injuries to different players, with just how the team was performing. So it's hard to say like to point out one piece of progress, but I will say like in this league, it's really hard to lose games when you're really defensively solid and defensively organized. You give yourself a chance to score that one goal to win a game, and the team was just so defensively solid this year collectively. And so like in terms of progress, it's not as if they weren't decent last year, even in a year that felt like a failure for not making the playoffs. But this year, I just don't have a lot of memories of like those big breakdowns consistently throughout the season. And, their goals against record, their expected goals against record, like all of that was just across the board, really promising.
And to sort of speak to your point, when they were really playing poorly this year, and there was a stretch of games where they only won, I think, one game, or they won 2 games, basically out of 9, I believe, was the worst stretch there. And even then, they only gave up 3 goals in a game once, and that was actually in a tie. And they gave up 1 or 2 goals in most of those games. So it was a defensively solid season, and in some ways I think they were able to lean on that even when things weren't going well. But for me, the areas where they made progress are in sort of talent identification. And the way that this came up in the Discord was discussing whether or not it was proven out to be a good decision to sort of not start the rebuild last year. And I suppose they could have done that by, buying out Ladero, or I suppose even buying or ridding themselves somehow of Rory Diaz, and sort of like bringing in that new DP at the start of last year. Difficult as that may have been, it was at least within the vague realm of possibility. It was certainly something that people were talking about doing. And my argument was, I don't know if they would be that much farther along on the rebuild now than they were then, in part because let's just say they had replaced Nico Ladero as a designated player last year. Let's just say that's a standout player. That probably means that Albert Rusnak is playing a line back, and then everything else is basically the same around him. And to me, one of the biggest things that we learned this year was the emergence of Josh Atencio as a potentially elite MLS, central midfielder. And that's something that we had been sort of championing a lot on this blog, or on this podcast, on Sounder at Heart. And to me, that along with the emergence of Jackson Reagan, who may have emerged either way, and as well as sort of like the rediscovery that Yamar is still an elite defender, that João Paulo was recovered from this injury, and frankly that Albert Rusnak could still be an effective number 10, were all things I thought that were really useful things that we learned this year. But Mark, in terms of progress, were there things that you like? Am I missing anything there that maybe we didn't see enough of, or you like that we saw progress wise?
Yeah, I think like we had conversations this summer, even like just a few months ago, 3 months ago, maybe around the time of the Leagues Cup exit, or that like disastrous Atlanta home game, where it was like, this roster has so much, it needs so much work done that it's going to make that 2013 offseason look like child's play, or something like that. And just 3 short months later, you go toe to toe with LAFC and you kind of catch a poor break, and that's just kind of how that goes, and you lose to LAFC in the playoffs. But you leave that game thinking, more or less, like this could be the lineup that opens the next season, and you would feel pretty much okay. Let's say 80% okay. So yeah, I think there was a bunch of like talent identification things that were identified. Like Rusnak should probably be the starting 10, or however you kind of want to make that midfield 3 work. You make that's your midfield 3. You want to probably upgrade or have some maybe options on the wings, because Christian was out for a long time. Leo Chu is crazy inconsistent. You maybe do something with your fullbacks, because that's an area where you're kind of like, are these the guys that like can really like elevate us the way that like a Brad Smith or Kelvin Ludam did? But then you look at everything else and you're like, yeah, Jordan Morris can be a starting striker in this league. Maybe we kind of do something with the depth behind him. But then you look at the center back partnership, and both center backs had a case to be first 11 players in the league. and actually probably both being that good hurt each other from
Right.
from maybe making that sort of like and those things are like very, very, very silly on its like base. But that's the kind of the quality. You have the best defense, you have the two best defenders, you have a very good goalkeeper, you have an incredible midfield, and then you're just kind of like sprinkling in some mostly just like attacking options, and then you have like a great team. Like we saw at the beginning of the year, this team could we saw that this team like had parts of a team that could probably go on and compete for a supporter shield. Obviously, like kind of the sustainability factor wasn't there with this team, but you have that core that was really good at the beginning of the season. You can build on that, and then it was also really good at the end of the season. So yeah, I think there's a lot that doesn't actually have to be done to make this team really incredible. And that's so encouraging heading into such a pivotal offseason.
Tim, let's start with you on this one. What was a highlight for you this year?
I think you could probably pick really particularly like any of those first 3 games as a highlight where they were just dismantling Salt Lake, Colorado, and St. Louis. I think that the win over St. Louis at the end of the season is another potential highlight. I think because it featured a Josh Atencio banger, I will speak in particular on behalf of the home St. Louis win. That was just such a dominant performance. Josh's goal was fantastic. St. Louis had started the season by showing, a level of quality that was a surprise to just about everyone, I think, and led them to first in the West. And the Sounders were the first team to really get one over on them and not somehow forget that Joao Klaus doesn't play on their team. That it was just such a fun game, and felt like it made the 2 wins prior to that all the more meaningful, especially after, so much hype had gone into the Club World Cup, and then that loss was pretty frustrating. To be able to start the season that well and have it sort of peak with that St. Louis win was quite the highlight.
Susie, what was a highlight for you this year?
I can't think of one game, but just overall, I just really think João Paulo is an amazing player. I could talk about him forever, and to have him return, he was such a we missed him so much last year, and it was just so evident to have him come back and slot in. So I would just say overall his return definitely stands out for me.
Did you have a highlight, Mark?
Yeah, I think mine's a little kind of like abstract, if that's okay. I would say like the playoff performance as a whole, where they kind of entered the playoffs after like a pretty solid, was it like 11 unbeaten, 9 unbeaten, something like that. But in 3 of the 4 playoff games that they played, they exuded like kind of like a dominance of control that you do not see in MLS. You just don't see, particularly that 3rd Dallas game, where you don't see one playoff team in MLS play another playoff team in MLS and just like nothing happens. You know what I mean? And that's really boring soccer to watch. I understand that the stadium was like very tense the entire time, but watching on TV, kind of removed, looking at it myself, I was just like, this gives me so much hope for the ideas that I think this coaching staff can continue to come up with. And then also the kind of their current sort of like resolve to take a very flawed roster and do what they did with it is just like, that's my highlight, because I didn't have that confidence in them a few months ago. And that kind of like the run that they went on, and then those performances really showed me that like there's such a solid like foundation here. And I know I'm basically saying the same thing with every answer, but yeah, that third Dallas game was probably my highlight, because, you know, even though they lost the LAFC game, it was a very similar performance where, but you know, maybe the best player in the league gets away on one chance and he scores it, and you're just kind of like, well, shoot, what can you do?
I'll just chime in to say I would hesitate to call this a highlight, but it's worth highlighting. Was the Sounders became the first MLS team to compete in the Club World Cup. Now, granted, that was almost a year ago.
Feels so long ago.
Yeah, it's almost. I mean, it's tempting to forget it, and it was a disappointing way to go out. You know, they went out in frankly a very similar way to the way their season ended, which was 1-0. Despite probably having the better play overall against Al Ali. But just playing in that, I thought was a good step forward. It was nice that the Sounders ended up being the last MLS team to play, or playing in the last iteration of this the tournament as it was formatted. When it comes back, the Sounders will be in it again, which is even makes even more important how big of a deal it was to win that 2022 CONCACAF Champions League, because effectively they got two Club World Cup buys out of it. And again, I don't know that I would call that a highlight of the season, but it was a notable achievement this year that's worth remembering, and it's easy to forget, like I said, because it was so long ago. But Susie, was there any? Would you say was the biggest disappointment for you?
For me, it was their performance at home, just overall. It was, you know, I do get to go to the games in person, and it was a slog to get through a lot of those games, especially in the middle of the season. And that's where historically we've just been so dominant. So, I mean, putting the playoffs aside, to Mark's point, that they played quite well at home there, but otherwise, it was a struggle.
Yeah, and I'll just piggyback that by adding some context. This was the Sounders' worst points per game performance in their MLS history at home. Historically, they've never had like a great home campaign where they just, they ran the table and they were effectively unbeatable or anything like that. But if you take the entirety of their home record, they are one of the best MLS teams in history. They've just been very consistent at home. And this year they really struggled, especially to score. I think they barely averaged more than a goal per game. It was a lot of ugly games at home this year. Tim, was there a biggest disappointment for you?
I really feel terrible calling out a particular player, but I can't help but think that Hebert is probably up there in terms of disappointments for this season, especially, having already shouted out how good they looked at the start of the season. He was such an important part of a lot of the beautiful attacking movement that was happening. He picked up a couple goals and was integral to the way they were moving through other teams' defenses. Just his hold-up play was fantastic. And then he just, if I remember correctly, he picked up a little injury and then just kind of disappeared. Couldn't really make his way back onto the field, even when he was seemingly healthy. And when he did get on the field, he racked up the XG, and that was about it. They splashed a not insignificant amount of allocation money and gave him a decent salary to bring him in. And I think for good reason. There was plenty of excitement about having him as a backup option behind primarily Raul. Maybe the disappointment is tempered a little bit by the fact that it allowed Jordan Morris the opportunity to make that number 9 spot his. And to good effect. But yeah, still a little tough to swallow how Hebert performed.
Yeah, again, adding a little bit of context there, he went 22 games without a goal across all competitions, which is a frankly, almost unbelievable stat. And yes, I think he got hurt. I think it was after the second game, maybe even he got hurt. He never really. He certainly never regained his form, but to me, there was a kind of 2-game turning point in his season, and it was 2 games where he racked up a lot of XG, which was the loss to Sporting Kansas City, where he was sort of played out of position. He started as a 10 in that game and looked completely out of sorts. Nico, I believe, started on the right in that game, and the first half was a complete disaster. And then there was the Austin game at home where I may be confusing these 2 games, but in both of those games, I think he had a bunch of chances where he just, where the Sounders had a chance to equalize and he wasn't able to do it. And he really was never the same player again after that. Mark, did you have a biggest disappointment?
Yeah, I would say it was both Portland games, where you can't not beat Portland, and then if you're not going to beat them, you can't just completely capitulate twice in the same season, because they go 1-0 up in Portland in like the 60th minute, 58th minute, or something like that.
No, I think it was 70th minute.
Oh, okay, even later, great. And then Portland comes back with 4 goals, and it's just like, the Sounders are supposed to be the team that does that type of thing to other teams. Like we had the famous DC United game, the New England Revolution games. We have our own Portland games where we just kind of like, the players come off the field and they're like, I thought my teammate was speaking a different language. That's how we looked in that first Portland game. The second Portland game is even more like, sends my blood pressure through the roof, because they actually go up 2-0. And
that was actually the third Portland game.
Oh,
there was also that totally forgettable 0-0 game.
Yeah, okay.
Where the 2 teams combined for like 0.5 XG.
Yeah, well, I guess all 3 Portland performances were bad then. But the other kind of famous capitulation is you go up 2-0, Leo Chu is unbeatable, and gets a red card, and you get Dyrone Spriad, which happens far too often to the Sounders. I hope he's retiring. Is he retiring?
I don't think so.
God. Okay. Yeah, it's those 2 Portland games in particular, but it's the performance against Portland as a whole.
Yeah. Unfortunately, a lot of good candidates for biggest disappointment this year, and I don't know if I have I guess I'll add one just for the sake of chiming in. But failing to score at home against LAFC in a playoff game, I don't know if it was the most unexpected or like, it wasn't like they played a bad game, but just that they ended the season in a scoreless, not failing to score at home, just felt like a little on the nose.
They didn't score against LAFC at all this season.
They didn't score. Yeah, you're right. In 3 games against LAFC, they didn't. They had a 0-0 tie toward the beginning of the season. Then they lost 1-0 where they gave up a goal in the first minute, I believe, and then they had the 1-0 loss at home in the playoffs. And what's even more frustrating about that, I think it makes it even more disappointing in a way, is that immediately after, I remember consoling myself of saying like, well, I don't know if I really thought they were going to win MLS Cup anyway. But what's really frustrating is kind of really knowing that they set themselves up to at least go to MLS Cup so well for all this season. There was so much reason, here we are on the day before MLS Cup, and frankly, the Sounders should be playing in this game. Like if they had just found, I really believe if they had found a goal in that game against LAFC, that they would be playing right now, because they were definitely, I think they were going to beat Houston at home. And frankly, I mean, I don't know. I think Columbus is probably the favorite in this one. I think they're maybe being underrated a little bit by the pundits. I think this is, to me, feels a little bit like the 2017 final, where everyone kind of including us, talked themselves into believing like, oh, the Sounders just know how to win this game. It doesn't matter that Toronto is the better team on paper, and it doesn't matter that, and Toronto seemingly was all in their own head. not to relitigate old things, but in any case, I like the crew in this game. I would have liked the crew against the Sounders, but it just feels like this is a game the Sounders should be in, and I still am not quite over that the Sounders aren't playing in this game.
But then you would have to be in Ohio.
So that's a fair point, a very fair point. And I guess as it played out, maybe I wouldn't have been able to go because of things that are going on at home. So maybe it was just as well.
But just think about the proposition of losing another final to an Ohio team.
Yes.
And that's really
another crew. It would have been potentially losing another one to the crew. So maybe it's just as well.
I just have one addition to the disappointment, and it's more of a personal one, which is just, and perhaps he comes back ultimately and it would be a miracle, but it just like hurts my heart. And I think a lot of other people that you didn't get like a true chance to thank Nico Ladero in some more meaningful way. It just is such a bummer to me personally.
And I will say that would have been one nice thing about playing in MLS Cup is there would have been this whole week kind of tributes of talking about like the national media being able to weigh in on how important of a player he was. And as it is, I do think that got overlooked in a way that isn't entirely fair. I think Seattle, was able to give him a reasonable farewell, but I don't think it felt very, it was our thing only, and it wasn't. And I think he deserves a little bit more than what he just got from the Sounders. So that's a good shout, Susie. Did anyone? One of the things that I had on the rundown here is biggest thing we learned. Does anyone feel like they want to chime in on something that maybe we didn't already go over in that sense?
I think for me, the biggest thing that we learned that we haven't really discussed a ton, although I have mentioned it, is the system that the team implemented kind of starting at the beginning of the season and then really brought back when things got going again, not coincidentally with the reintroduction of Christian Roldan, but that counter-pressing system, figuring out which players in particular worked really well, but I think that it also highlighted the effectiveness of Josh Atencio. I think when Christian Roldan was missing, it was clear that there were things that Christian Roldan does that no one else who played in that right wing spot really offers, in terms of doesn't really lead the press, but he is a key figure in getting the most out of Alex Roldan on the right side, allowing whoever is playing as the 10 to function a bit more effectively. I think we saw that Josh Atencio offers a lot of the same things when he's played in the center of midfield. So even if you don't have Christian there on the right, you're still getting a lot of that same support and running that makes everything a little bit easier for everyone else. I think figuring out that system, seeing how well it works with Jordan Morris and Albert Rusnak leading the press, I think just makes decisions that need to be made this offseason and going forward that much clearer. I think that's the biggest takeaway for me in those terms.
Yeah, and Matt Doyle, I thought, did a good job of highlighting this in some of his end of season content, and talking about how prior to this year, the Sounders system really oftentimes felt like let Nico cook was sort of like their system, which was he's going to just go find the game, and to the degree that he can make things happen, that's what's going to happen. And I never thought that was an entirely fair way of presenting it. But the Sounders did look like they didn't have ideas when Nico wasn't out on the field. And one thing we saw this year is that the system sort of did do a little bit better job of creating balance, so to speak. And yes, you can point to Christian, the record without Christian, and say like, well, you've just shifted the onus to a different player. I'm a little more optimistic that this system, now that it's been fully implemented, and because like part of what threw off the system when Christian was out was that Nico wasn't really being positionally disciplined, and he was sort of just he was still sort of trying to make the game while the other 10 players on the field were sort of playing the system. And my hope is that in the future, with when Christian goes out, which I would imagine inevitably he will, that they will do that if Rusnak is playing that 10 spot, that they can sort of build around that a little bit easier, whether it be a Paul Rothrock or, hey, maybe it's this Pedro de la Vega guy who they're close to signing, or or maybe it's Albert Rusnak moving over. Like, there are other solutions I think that they can maybe work that don't make it so reliant on Christian to create that balance. We'll see.
Watson's Counter wants to thank everyone for their patience, but now the wait is over. Located at 6420 24th Avenue Northwest in Ballard, they've reopened in a brand new location with the same bomb-ass coffee and the same dumbass vibes. You can still expect their classics like the gochujang fried chicken sandwich and Fruity Pebbles French toast, alongside their new soft serve program and their world-class coffee. Make sure to follow them on Instagram for all the latest and greatest.
All right. So this is maybe a related question, but I do want to get everyone's take on this, or at least give some of you an opportunity to weigh in. Susie, which player do you feel like we learned the most about this year?
I think I have two in my mind, but I'm going to go with one of them. I actually think it's Leo Chu, and I think it's that I learned a couple of things. One is he truly can thrive with this team, and he can create really big moments. But two, he is player with very, very specific talents, and the team, I think, still doesn't know how to best utilize them. It's like we haven't really had a player like him in the system, and I feel like we're still trying to figure out if he fits in the system, and if so, like, how do you best build a team around him so he can do what he does best. So I feel like we saw some great moments of him from him. He took a huge step up from what people have maybe had expectations from him last year, but the team just still doesn't seem like it's either, it's has an answer to whether it's like, is this the player he's always going to be, or can we really build a team that really helps him thrive?
I'm inclined to assume that both of you will say Josh Atencio, and we've kind of gone over Josh a little bit, but is there someone else that you guys I'll say that, or what was the other player? I'm sorry, Susie, you said you had two players.
Well, my other was Jackson Reagan. So I don't know. If someone else had him, I will let them take him.
Well, do either one of you not want to talk? You can talk about, one of you can talk about Josh, but
I'll not talk about Josh and let.
Okay.
I feel like I've talked about Josh enough. People are tired of me talking about Josh. And I'm gonna kind of go like in like a negative way. And I think we learned a lot about Nuhu this season, in a sense that, like, he probably shouldn't be solely responsible for that position to get the best out of him. And that's like a very political answer. But so, like, we've kind of referenced this like ambiguous like system, and effectively what that ends up being on the field is Nuhu is playing this kind of like not left back fully, kind of in a modern sense, but also not a committed third center back. And he's this sort of like release valve on the back line. And he hates having the ball. He hates having the ball. I've never seen a left back hate having the ball more than he hates having the ball. And we had
but he loves calling for it.
He loves getting the ball, but then once he has it, he hates having the ball, because then he turns around and passes it Jackson Reagan and then yells at whoever passed to him. So with that said, it was very encouraging towards the end of the season when Reed Baker Whiting kind of came on as this almost antithesis to Nuhu, where it was like he was not interested in defending at all and he wanted to be as far forward as he could. But we've basically gone like 3 seasons now expecting Nuhu to kind of take this like leap, so to speak. And maybe you write off last season because of all the injuries, and maybe you write off this season because it's a transition, and then maybe you write off the season before that because it was a completely different system that was like tailor-made for him. But then you just kind of start like making all these excuses for a player that isn't like good enough to make those excuses for. Like on the flip side, you have people making a bunch of excuses for Albert Rusnak, and then you moved into his best position and he scored 7 game-winning goals. So it's like, do we really have to be having these conversations about a player that is ultimately like hasn't really become good enough to have these conversations about? So let's just like have a different thing to do. And I know we did this season, and ultimately it was a very young person who clearly struggled, like his body struggled with kind of the rigors of like a professional soccer league, and maybe that goes away, but maybe he's also just kind of keeps experiencing growing pains until he's maybe in his 20s, like Josh Atencio. But I think like specifically Brian Spencer teams are the best when he can have Nuhu kind of do the quote unquote elite defensive stuff, which I will take. I'll argue about that. I don't think it's actually that elite, but it's specific. He can do that stuff when he needs to, but then having a better kind of all around left back for, let's say, the 25, 20, 18 other games a season that you need that from. So I think this season was a huge missed opportunity for Nuhu. It started really well. Like he did that kind of release valve thing really well. And then he just sort of regressed. And when he could have, like, I don't know, had more confidence or what. But ultimately, I'm just like kind of like this can't keep being the conversation we have every single season about this player that is like just fine, really. He's just fine.
Tim, did you want to chime in on this topic?
Yeah, I think Susie, you may be included as well, but I think we're all members of the Atencio agenda. I think when he initially broke out and then was hampered by injury, he looked like he could really be a serious asset for the Sounders. I know one of Mark's major critiques at that point was that he's very good at the things he's good at, but he doesn't offer a ton going forward, and he particularly didn't shoot. He learned how to shoot this year. It only turned into 1 goal, but he created a lot of really good chances. He showed an ability to make dangerous runs from that central midfield spot that, other than Albert Rusnak playing in that spot, no one else who has played there recently is really effective at doing. He showed an impressive vision when he's on the field, both for the runs that need to be made and the runs that are being made of his teammates. He showed confidence to be able to hit the passes that needed to be hit for those runs to be rewarded. He has continued to grow into his sizable frame, and he offers a presence physically in that central midfield that the Sounders haven't had since Gustav. He just has come on in leaps and bounds. It's really unfortunate that a stomach bug kept him from playing with the Olympic team. But I think just the fact that he got called in is a level of recognition for what he has accomplished and what the team has accomplished with him this season. I do want to throw a tiny little shout for the 2 of Cody Baker and Reed Baker Whiting. To Mark's point, we did see that there are options in the team that are not Nuhu at left back. Neither Reed or Cody is naturally a left back. Neither of them is a left-footed player. But when they played in that spot, they both did really well. They showed pretty well on the right side as well. I think knowing that if they can stay healthy and can continue to progress, the Sounders have really good options, not only as potential starters, but as backups for both fullback spots.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just add this sort of piggyback on that. I think the Sounders also learned or had the most proof yet that their academy is producing MLS quality talent. And it has sort of turned into a little bit of a conveyor belt, not necessarily producing elite talent. And it may never get to that point where they're constantly producing players that are to be sold to Europe. But, I do think we saw some progress in terms of Obed Vargas, Reed Baker Whiting, Cody Baker. These are all players Josh Atencio, who are proving themselves to be MLS quality talents, and they might have upside to bring in some money. But just the fact that this is that they can reliably fill out their roster with players that are internal promotions is a pretty significant thing that I think that we were sort of that we got to put into practice a little bit more this year and at least it felt like than previous years, because it wasn't just one guy piling up a bunch of minutes. It was a bunch of younger players showing that they could do a job when they needed to.
And even if they don't even necessarily have to turn into players that are good for the Sounders or like sold for $10 million or whatever is happening in Dallas. They can be Hanwala Balana and be a valuable asset for another MLS team that brings in allocation money that frees up the Sounders to do other things. I forget what the corresponding move to the Balana Nashville trade was. And obviously it didn't really work out on the other side.
Well, no, they got I think they got $200,000 allocation and Jimmy Madranda in that trade.
So the allocation money was really important. The other things, maybe not so much.
Oh, I don't know. Jimmy Madranda.
Well, yeah, I guess Madranda scored like some really good goals.
Yeah, exactly.
I think to add to the, effective conveyor belt nature of the academy, Jackson Reagan is a bit more removed from his academy days, but I think often, probably not by anyone here, but outside of maybe the most in the know Sounders fans, doesn't get included in those conversations because he's not a homegrown player, because he went through the draft and, spent 4 years in college, but he spent a year with Tacoma Defiance. And since then, I know people like Wade Weber were talking about him as like the next Chad Marshall. And that seemed like maybe a little bit of hyperbole and just a suggestion that, well, he's a really clean player and he's got these impressive tools. But I think this year in particular, he played really well last year, but showed some potential to make mistakes and whatever. But, that's not to be unexpected in a player who's new to first division soccer. This year, he looked like a legitimately elite MLS defender. You don't have to go to Europe to be an elite player and be, a huge credit to the Sounders developmental system, not just the academy.
Well, I'm going to start with this next one with Mark, because I feel like he's maybe the person who has put himself most out there in terms of having strong opinions. And I say that as a credit to you. But is there something this year that you felt like you ultimately were wrong about?
Yeah. I think at the beginning of the year, I was pretty confident that this team would be fine for the whole season. Like I to a point that we started talking about a little bit earlier. There was obviously a huge discussion last offseason that they needed to completely blow up the team and completely rebuild it. And I was one of the people that was pretty prominently outspoken saying, no, this is a really good team. They just need to get healthy. And then to kind of dovetail that into a very specific point is I was so ready to champion Bear's 12 goals a season that was supposed to happen this year.
Yeah.
And I know that like kind of his big misses maybe in the middle or the first third of the season kind of started this like giant XG debate within the kind of Sounders fan base. And I was like pretty wrong about that because I'm a prominent believer that if you kind of got a good system and you're generating enough expected goals or just chances that you should score, it'll come good. And what ultimately didn't come good with this team is frankly, they just weren't talented enough. And good players score goals. Good players also defend the goals, which we generally have good players back there, but we just didn't have enough good players to score the goals. And I thought we would have.
Susie, did you feel like there was something notable you were wrong about?
I don't tend to have really strong opinions, so not that I'm saying that I'm always right, but like nothing comes to
It
mind.
does make it harder to walk things back when you didn't. Yes,
Yeah, but I will say that I watching the team last year, I was still like convinced that it was okay to play Albert Rusnak a little bit deeper. I felt like he's such a smart player. He makes everything look really easy, which makes people like not be able to see some of the things he does really well, even from a deeper spot. But I think seeing him play higher and be able to better be that connection in the attacking third definitely did prove me wrong with that assumption.
Tim, did you have anything you want to put in there?
Yeah, I think first I would sort of counter Susie's point that I think you weren't necessarily wrong to believe that Albert Rusnak was well used a line back. It just was maybe not the most right position because I feel very similar to how you feel. I think at the time it made a lot of sense. It just is that other things made more sense later on when you figured out other things about how the team was structured and performing. I think the thing I was most wrong about is not something that I necessarily have ever tweeted about, and I probably wouldn't ever like put it out publicly except right now. But I have in several conversations over the course of this season, particularly when things were not going well, even before the start of this season, and I have held this opinion at various other points in the past and then been proven completely wrong. But I felt pretty strongly at various points that this was probably going to be Brian Schmetzer's last season, that, you know, he deserves an incredible amount of credit for what he's accomplished in charge of the Sounders. And, you know, maybe the 50th anniversary provides a good transition point for him to move into a different role in the organization, and they bring someone else to freshen up the tactics or the team's approach to things. But it seemed like the same issues kept cropping up, and they'd implement a new system or approach, and then teams would figure it out, and they wouldn't really be able to adjust to other teams adjusting to them. And then once again, Brian Schmetzer figured it out. Like, he is, even for his proponents, a better player, a better manager than we give him credit for. And I am very glad that he is going to continue to be in charge.
I'll support that position as well. There was definitely a point this year where I kind of talked myself into, I think even publicly, I think I may have even said I thought there was an equally good chance that the Sounders could miss the playoffs and he would be back, and that they could get to MLS Cup and he wouldn't be back. And I just thought that it was basically saying there's no rhyme or reason to this. But I think I had kind of become comfortable with the idea that maybe it was time to move on from Brian. But I thought he did show me that he can be more flexible than sometimes he gets credit for. I will say that the one thing I ended up being wrong about was I really did not think it was that big of a deal that the Sounders let Sam Adeniran go. I liked him. I thought he was a good player. I still think on some level, letting him go was the right thing to do because there was no indication the Sounders were actually going to give him a shot. But I just didn't necessarily think it was that big of a deal. And in hindsight, it was maybe a more of a missed opportunity than I realized, because he, I think we all saw what he could do when he was playing for Defiance. Whether or not he was ever going to be able to translate that to MLS was sort of a eye of the beholder situation. But clearly, it was. To me, he's a player who has established himself as a very viable MLS goal scorer. And whether or not it was the right thing for the Sounders to let him go, I do think it was a pretty big deal that they ended up letting him go for almost nothing. He was, I think that was probably a situation where the Sounders owed it to themselves to give him more minutes. And I don't think it was a Eber versus Adeniran thing. I think that's overly simplifying it, but it's also not hard to imagine a alternate reality where they give the minutes they gave to Eber to Adeniran, and maybe it works out better, or at least they figured out a way to more effectively use his talents. Because I think that's one thing that I really hope evolves within the Sounders, is this kind of idea that you always want your best, that you have your best 11 players and you want to get them as many minutes as possible, and you don't always give yourself the opportunity to use players off the bench to just sort of change the way you're playing. And I think Adeniran really offered the Sounders an opportunity to do that, and they never really did it. And that's, I think it ended up being a bigger missed opportunity than I realized at the time of when they would let him go.
I think it's easy to look at his season and reflect on all of those things. I also think St. Louis's system just fits his style so well. So it's always so hard to compare. Like, would you have had those results if he got the same amount of minutes in Seattle? To me, it's really hard to say. Not to say I'm discounting anything you just said. I just think sometimes people don't take a step back and look at that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the circumstance he was placed in St. Louis set up really nicely for him. And it should be said, he didn't have instantaneous success there. He got loaned again. He again got sent on a midseason loan. So it wasn't like they were these huge believers in him. But, when he did get his second chance there, he made the most of it. And I just would like to see the Sounders and Brian in particular be a little bit more open-minded about how he uses his bench, because I feel like he gets stuck in these patterns of, well, I want Jordan on the field at the end of the game, so I'm always going to have him out there, or I want Raul on the field at the end of the game, so I'm just going to leave him out there for 90 minutes. When sometimes you just got to change things up. And I think that's one thing that the Crew, I think, have done a really good job of during their run, is figuring out creative ways to get their bench players on the field. I mean, it helps when you have a Julian Gressel or a Ramirez coming off the bench. But either way, I think that's just kind of the next step for the Sounders. Susie, was there anything you feel like you were vindicated on, that you feel like you, even if you didn't make some big public pronouncement, that you even just internally felt like, okay, this is playing out exactly how I thought?
It's cheating a little bit because it's so specific, but the first game, it's like the third game of the season where Hebert got hurt and they lost on the road to Cincinnati. There was a lot of talk after that game, like, oh, if Hebert was in the game, we would have won. And I said at the time, it was our midfield that lost the game, not having Hebert. And I feel very vindicated in that now at this point in the season.
That's very fair. Tim, anything you feel particularly vindicated on?
I think I feel pretty vindicated by the performances of. I shouted out Reed Baker Whiting and Cody Baker earlier, so I will let that stand, but I would also add Paul Rothrock. That I figured him coming to him coming home after spending time in the TFC system, I thought it was going to be a good addition, but maybe just basically as like veteran leadership for Defiance. And when he got his opportunities with the Sounders, he absolutely made the most of them and scored in every competition he played in. I think he is a genuine talent, maybe MLS fringe talent, but the kind of player that I think gets ignored a lot for having, gone through college soccer and being a little bit older than people expect a prospect to be, but showed he's still got a lot to offer.
Anything, Mark, that you want to thump your chest on?
No, I took a lot of L's this season.
Yeah, I'll give a shout out for Stephen Fry's performance, who I sort of felt like there was a time early in the season where I sometimes felt like the public opinion was starting to turn against Steph, and I sort of kept pointing back to his numbers and kept saying like, no, I think this is still like he's still the same player he kind of has always been. And I do think that was sort of born out. Like I think that he wasn't necessarily the best keeper. But I do think he's still in the conversation for a top 5 keeper in the league. I think that he's probably got he's got tread left on the tires. He seems motivated. And I think I'm really happy that the Sounders seem to now be placing a succession plan in place where one of Andrew Thomas or Jacob Castro is going to sort of have the opportunity to be his backup and to potentially be the next Sounders goalkeeper, which I think is really smart planning by the Sounders. But I think I'm really glad that he's going to be back next year, because I don't know that there is a obvious improvement to be had over him, especially without trying to break the bank. I know he's not the perfect keeper. He doesn't really do much outside of the penalty area. He's not a great passer, but man, he is reliable. And I think that's ultimately the thing you want out of your goalkeeper, is you want a goalkeeper who's not going to lose you games. And Steph Fry, for his lack of perfection, he is not going to lose you games. And that's something I feel, maybe I'm overstating how much opinion had turned against him, but at times it did feel like it was going that way, and I thought he finished the season strong. All right, well, let's end it here. I'll start with you, Mark, since you kind of skipped on this last one. What's one thing you hope to see either this off season, whether it be a player acquisition or a change or anything else?
I feel like I'm not like I shouldn't talk about the left back position here, so I'm not going to. And I kind of want to so the Sounders either have depending on some roster mechanisms that may or may not be introduced this offseason, but as things stand, they currently have the opportunity to use 2 more of their kind of U22 initiative spots, at least 2 more. Let's put it that way. I would like to see 2 players come in with kind of the tactical flexibility you were talking about that allow sort of, 2 younger players to come in and just give them the freedom to change games. And it's not necessarily oh, you're coming in as Christian Roldan's backup, or you're coming in as the backup defensive midfielder, or you're coming in as Jordan Morris's backup. But it's more of you can play those positions if those players are hurt, but also you do it differently. And you're probably faster because those guys are getting older or, kind of something like that. And just get I want to see a lot more the way that this roster gets constructed over this offseason. I would love to see a lot more tactical flexibility and options that the team can play, because while I have been sort of converted into a believer of this system, there are games where you just need Will Bruin to come on and score 2 goals against Columbus on the road and win a game. Like you just need to do the long ball thing. And funny enough, like the one game that was very like tactically fluid in that sense, 3 defenders scored against Vancouver, right? Like Yamar went up and scored and all that. So I would just like to see like towards the end of the season, the roster got so rigid and it was like these basically 13 guys are going to play and nobody else will. So whether that's either through signings or as Tim pointed out, maybe Paul Rothrock makes some steps up and offers something different. I just think with like where this league is headed, the Sounders need to shed some of like kind of the previous era where it's like these are the 15 guys and that's it type of thing, and they need a lot of different options basically, and maybe a different left back.
Susie, is there something you really want to see this offseason?
No, I agree a lot with what Mark said. Sometimes it feels like they didn't have a player that could change a game in a different way, or that they played the same way or like defended the same way every game versus like maybe just having the tactical flexibility to shift a little bit. So I definitely agree with that. One very specific thing that I would like to see though next year is for the team to be a lot more ruthless on set pieces. I feel like we let so many set pieces go this year that could have been goals, and I would like to see that change.
Got something cooked up, Tim?
Yeah, I think the one primary thing and then a secondary sort of similar thing elsewhere, but a real viable, consistent, non-Christian Roldan option on right wing. As has been mentioned already, the Sounders' struggles in the middle of the season really coincided with Christian suffering concussions and being unavailable for an extended period of time. Going to the Gold Cup didn't help with his availability, but really him picking up the concussion and then missing that Portland road game started the troubles for the Sounders. I mentioned earlier that Josh Atencio sort of addresses some of the role that Christian fills on the right that wasn't being filled by other players on the field, but having someone who, you know, down the road maybe can make that position their own, but in the intermediary time can be a legitimate either game-changing option, or when Christian is available for one reason or another, there at least is not going to be a huge drop. I think, you know, if the Sounders do sign Pedro de la Vega, he can play in that spot. I think he solves a lot of difficult issues, whether he becomes the starting left and then Leo Chu is an option off the bench, or he serves as that right-sided player, whatever. But similarly, I think establishing a succession plan behind Joao Paulo, maybe that's Josh Atencio and one of the other players comes in alongside him, but starting to use the steadiness of the current core of the team as an opportunity to start planning for the future a little bit more as we transition to this new era, figuring out what is the future after Albert Rusnak, what's the future after Joao Paulo. Those, I think, are the other big priorities.
Yeah, I'll say this with the caveat that I think everything you guys said is probably more important than what I'm about to say, but it is something that I hope that we see this year is the Sounders' ability to put players into the foreign marketplace successfully. I do think is actually, on some level, I think we sometimes talk about this sort of as a point of pride, but I do think there is actually a real practical matter to this. And I think we see it with LAFC, we see it with the Columbus Crew, we've seen it with Dallas, for that matter, is that the ability to sell players into foreign teams really changes the kind of player you can bring in to the Sounders. You know, the Sounders do work on a budget. They work as a team. They try to keep it pretty, their soccer budget relatively, if not literally in the black. Certainly, they aren't in this to lose money in. They're not lighting money on fire, so to speak. This is not an oil state that is running the Sounders, and I don't think that's what we want. But I think what we want is for this to be a sustainable enterprise. I think that has real value in terms of the on-field product, and a big part of that, frankly, is going to be selling players, or at least putting them into loans that potentially turn into sales. And I don't want that to be totally transactional, but it is a reality of soccer right now. And so the sooner that they can get involved in that marketplace, I think the better for them, and the better product that it will make here. So with all that said, I think this was a good bridge season. Like Mark said earlier in the show, ultimately this is the success or failure of the season is probably going to be determined by what happens in the next few years. But it was an interesting one. It was a different kind of season for the Sounders. But thank you guys and gals for joining me on this show, for doing this throughout the year. It has been a really satisfying year for me personally, just because we were able to take Sounder at Heart independent. It seems like we have a, speaking of sustainability, it does feel like we've created something sustainable with the support of you all's content, but also with the support of our listeners and our readers. This has been really satisfying for me, and hopefully you have enjoyed it as well. With all that said, signing off for Tim Foss, Mark Kastner, Susie Rance, I'm Jeremiah Shan. This is Nos Adietes, and we will catch you next time.
We love you. Let's win another one.